Hey, welcome to my podcast. My name is Dr. Brendan McCarthy. I am the Chief Medical Officer of Protea Medical Center in Chandler, Arizona. My office is moving soon. I'm very excited about it. It's the biggest thing that has ever happened in my career, I think, is the move of this practice. It's going to be revolutionary. I'm super excited about it. But it's actually, Paul and I met in 2003. He was a clinical director at the medical school I was attending. And he was the most influential person in the way I practice medicine. This is the second part of an interview I've been doing with Dr. Anderson, or Paul, regarding how he became the physician he is and how he developed the style of practicing medicine he does. Because you guys, and I said this in the last episode, I'm going to repeat it, I live in my bubble. I practice medicine with a group of physicians, and we all practice in a similar way. We see the individual in front of us and we practice the best medicine we can. If we don't understand it, we're going to keep applying ourselves till we do understand it. We run lab work. We listen to you. And the results are there. And I just think that's the way medicine is supposed to be practiced, because that's how I was trained. That's how I think, and that's what I'm exposed to daily. And that's not a great answer for those of you who are in another country or another state who don't have this kind of care. It's important for me to do my best to articulate to you how I got to this place, because there are other physicians out there that watch this podcast. I do get your messages, I know. And I wanted to give you a better understanding of how I've gotten to be where I am with my approach to medicine. And this is the person I think is the best person to talk about it with. The thing about Dr. Anderson, the last episode, he was articulating his path to getting to this point. We talked about some of his early cases in the first few months of practice. And I wanted to use that as my segue into talking about Dr. Anderson's history and a little bit of his bio and how he's gotten to be here and what he is now and where he practices. So many of you may not know him, but those of you who do know him, you know him. So Dr. Anderson started practice in Oregon, graduating from medical school. He began practicing. And then sometime around 2002, 2003, he was offered a position at the Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine to be the clinical director. So Dr. Anderson, it was clinical director, they called it specifically.
Division director, yeah, of clinical sciences.
All right, so we got that. So I want to make sure you're right. So he moved his whole family down from Washington to Arizona. You were in Oregon, excuse me.
Oregon, yeah.
Oregon down to Arizona. And he started educating because he could practice and teach. And we were lucky for that. And that's when I first met him. Dr. Anderson then proceeded to develop courses online for boards, for basic sciences, and then for clinical boards. He went on to develop courses for physicians to train them to become better physicians, not just as a student, but also as practicing physicians. He then proceeded to move on to Washington State, where he worked at Bastyr University, and he helped develop, or he actually developed the IV protocols, an IV program that Bastyr uses, and he was pioneer in that area. He did that for how many years?
It's full-time for 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah. I still go back and teach now and then, yeah.
Then started a practice at the same time. Mm-hmm. He was practicing in Seattle at the same time as he was teaching and directing that program. Dr. Anderson then went from that point to develop his own. How do I describe what you do, buddy? How do I describe what you do? Because you still practice, but you are now developed to the point where you are taking the things that you've learned, the way that you approach people as patients, and the accountability you have that you mentioned in the last episode. And you now sit down with physicians and teach this to them. And it's become your full-time work. And you always, had a strong clinical and, educational, but it's grown in a way because you now have, I don't know how to describe because you have a website that has, online education. You are having constant webinars. You have, this semi-annual, twice a year conferences that you hold, and it's a big thing. Mm-hmm. And I remember you growing it, and it wasn't grown because people out there will start growing something because they're like, I'm going to make myself a business. There's a need in the market. I'm going to do this because, I'm going to make some money at this. Paul is the guy who's like, I can educate and do more and create more and be more helpful. And it's something, one of those things I've always been, I always admire that in you. Hmm. So the through line of Dr. Anderson is that as he grew and developed these skill sets and this ability to perceive patients from more than just a simple algorithmic lens, as you'd say, or approach, he not only developed himself as a care provider, but he dedicated time and energy to education. And in those days, the education didn't pay well. It was a labor of love. I remember that. I remember those years with you. I remember you were answering questions all the time, on your cell phone. You were generous and kind to people who were in need, students, doctors. You still are, and I admire you for that. I really, really, really do. You're a very patient and a very caring man. So the through line of Dr. Anderson and some of the things I want to bring up, very specific, and I had a better way of thinking about it earlier, but I'm just going to do it now, just pop it in here. When was that you published that work on MTHFR? You were one of the pioneers of understanding MTHFR and the role it plays in fibromyalgia. I want to use that as an example of who you are for those who don't know.
So that was, I believe, 2012. And the genesis of that particular work was that at the time, as you mentioned, still am in Seattle area, full-time at Bastyr, and also I had a practice concurrently. And the practice just kept growing, and then we another practice had to close that was all fibromyalgia chronic fatigue patients, and we took all of their patients on, and that was
I remember that.
Yeah, it was.
I remember that.
Huge. So we had our sort of normal mix of patients, which was about half cancer patients and half people with chronic illness, and then this big influx of chronic fatigue fibro patients. And again, going back to what we said in part one, each one of those have their symptoms that are similar, but for very different reasons. Or some are similar, but there's threads, but they're different. So the genesis of that came out in 2012 was, and now, because 2012 was 22 years ago, right? Is that true?
No, don't do that to me. It's 12.
12 years ago.
Me 22 years ago. Wait, no, I'm not yet, Paul.
No, you and I met 20 some years ago. No, 2012. All right. Yeah, so math is not strong. Yeah. All right. So it's just 12 years. It's a while ago. Yeah. Nowadays, most people know that, they can send off and get genomics done, and there's these fancy programs that'll figure everything out and give you reams of reports. Back then, the testing was not available, and then it was available in a sort of minor way, which wasn't so bad because it sort of gave us it gave us an opening so that patients could get the testing actually paid for by their insurance. But it was before it became real popular and insurance stopped paying for those sort of things. So we were able to help this big group of people. But this is another one of the things where a lot of roads kind of come together. If you think of looking at genomics, and especially nutrigenomics, which is where the nutritional part of your epigenetic signature crosses with your genetic code. Back then, unless you understood the biochemistry of the genes that were coding for enzymes in a particular area, you could know all about the genes, from a test maybe, and there weren't that many tests, but and you had no idea what to do with the information. I was in a position where I've been teaching so long, and one area that I taught a lot was pharmacology and biochemistry. And so I would sort of see folks, and prior to genomic testing, I would always think there's probably some gene things, because like all of these people with this type of fatigue or whatever. There's, what we do for them doesn't work, but what we do for these other people works better, and they get resolution of their symptoms. So that seems genetic to me, right? There's no way to check. So what we did was, kind of having that background, I looked and I said, well, what can I test? And one thing was methylation was just becoming a thing more commercially, like in labs. You could test it earlier.
2005, just a segue really quick. In 2005, I remember you teaching about methylation and the role it plays, and we always thought of it just as homocysteinosis. But I remember you pushing down the pathway of understanding with serotonin and neurotransmitters. I just remember that moment just now when you were saying that. I'm sorry, it's great memory.
And if you, usually what I would say in those classes, especially back then, was, I know this seems like arcane information, but someday this will be important for you guys to remember, because it's going to be, we'll know more about why these things work the way they do. So I was in this position where, okay, so I had that background, but I have this big group of people where I've gotten them, a step at a time, better, and then a lot of them plateaued. So they weren't like they were when they started, but they weren't really where they wanted to be, quality of lives, et cetera. And I thought, well, at the time, okay, we can test, this area, methyl cycle. It's very highly possible, because that's involved in neurotransmitters, like you mentioned, but it's also involved in turnover of cells, which would be, they all had gut problems. Gut turns over very quickly. They all had hematologic things. Your bone marrow turns over very quickly. As we mentioned, neurotransmitters and a host of other things. And it's just one of those things you think, who knows? So I was seeing all of them, quite frequently. So I told them, okay, well, we're going to do this other test and see, if you have any troubles there, because we know now that we could supplement around those genetic problems if they're there. And so what we did in that little clinical study was, part one was just, is there a difference between people with diagnostic criteria positive chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and their methylation versus heritage matched normal controls who don't have fibromyalgia. And the reason you have to do heritage match is you cannot, with most genomic things, you don't want to compare, say, Southeast Asian people with Caucasians or with people from African background, et cetera, because their genomic heritability is so different. So you'll see, like in this case, there are certain genetic pedigrees, from heritability where incidence is less than 1%. And there's others where it's, 40, 50%, right? So that was that was part A. And we showed there that the two variations that would cause the most symptoms were not just a little higher, they were 50 to 70% higher in people with chronic fatigue fibro. And then because we already had them and we could treat them, then part two was, well, let's treat them. So they all had a baseline, and there was a score. There's these validated scores for chronic fatigue and fibro symptom, quality of life, et cetera. And everything else we had worked on up to that point was kind of optimized hormonally, gut-wise, chronic infections, toxins, all that stuff. And they plateaued. So we had a plateau base, and then our only change, which back in that day we called it active comparator trial because you're your own control, was we supplemented nutritionally around their genomic problem. And then we tracked them for a number of months more, and in general, their scores greatly increased. The more trouble they had in their genetics that was not being addressed, the more symptomatic they were, but also the more they responded positively. So that was that, and it sort of by happenstance and sort of just by the time, there was a group I believe led by a Harvard researcher that had done something similar but with treatment-resistant depression. They were psychiatrists. And when we got this data, I was just really excited about it because, I mean, I already saw it had worked, and then it took forever to get the math done. So I actually emailed the lead author at Harvard, and I said, I know you just published about treatment-resistant depression, but I said, I don't expect anything other than I have to share these numbers with you. This is kind of amazing, and these people also have some, depression sometimes, et cetera. And he actually wrote me back, and he said, we didn't publish it, but he says we see the same thing with, which was very validating that, they in groups that they weren't keeping, track of for publication, that they saw that there were benefits in chronic illness and stuff like that. So that was, but I mean, I've done that for many, many things over time. But it was something that actually kind of got out there into the world. And every now and then I'll be searching for something. I'll see me come up, and then it's like, oh, I did that.
I still use your article for handouts to explain MTHFR. And that little janky, remember you had to use these old, I don't know what you used for it. You used to use it to make your graphics.
Yeah.
It was so hard to make good graphics back then.
Yeah.
But that graphic still stands the best time. I still use your graphic over any others
to
still explain MTHFR. It's brilliant.
The only time it doesn't work is if there's a software upgrade, because I was teaching 3 months ago in another group, and they ran my slides through a software, and literally it was just the 2 boxes, the 2 different colors, and all the arrows, but there was no text. So it was like a million arrows, and I was like,
you remember how much work it took to put it together back then with arrows and the positions?
It was horrible. It was just,
it's so much work.
It was terrible.
Yeah, I remember.
I greatly appreciate graphic programs.
Yeah, they're way better now. But
yeah,
that brings me into this part I want to ask you is like, there's a saying out there, when you come up with something revolutionary, they're going to knock it, and then they're going to mock it, and then they're going to stock it. The idea is that they're going to make fun of it, they're going to dispel it, it doesn't work. And MTHFR, there's a reason I brought this up. MTHFR is one of those things. People, they used to say there's no such thing, this is malarkey, this is not a true thing. And then if you're treating them like, oh, he's just a quack, yeah, whatever, it's not really good science, it's just blah. And then now, you're seeing these. I had a case today where I had a patient, she has treatment-resistant depression. She had the genetic test on MTHFR. She's heterozygous, but they only did one. They didn't do both. And I'm seeing now it's being adopted by mainstream medicine. And why I'm bringing this up is the patients, the people who watch this podcast, they go to their doctors, they have mood, they have a lot of things. But one of the things I'll bring up specifically is I'll just use this as an example. They'll have depression or anxiety or insomnia, and we know this is a hormone imbalance because it's worse around their cycle. And these are the things. And their doctors either dispelling it completely or they're making fun of it. Mm-hmm. And we know, and we could hundreds of different cases where there was something that used to be considered heretical, and now it's considered commonplace, must be done in medicine. Mm-hmm. And when I see my patients in that place, I don't even know where I'm going to go with this question, but the idea is like they're at this place and they're stuck. They don't have this. They can't find doctors who are here yet, and they're in this place trying to navigate through here. Do you have any advice? I know I've talked to you about this for years. You have patients who consult with you in their other countries, or you do. I know this, and you have patients who consult with you who are in other states, and they have to go through their care providers. You have to work through them with their care providers. And have you found a way when you have a patient and you're working with them and you directly can't provide the care, and you and that patient know that this is what this is, and you know that the lab will do it, or you know the treatment will do it? How do you help the patient? How do you help them navigate that space with care providers that are not gonna help? Do you have advice on that? Or resistant? Yeah. Care providers who are resistant, let me put it that way.
Yeah, it's, that has always been a problem. It's no less of a problem now. So two parts. One is that
Dude, someone's walking on the roof, and you're on the top roof. We're top level. Someone's gonna jump in the pool from here, I bet you.
All right. Well,
Sorry.
okay. So I'll answer. There's really two parts to the answer, such as it exists. That frustration, both on the side of providers who just want to know more, and because providers are sort of in a spectrum, as we all know. There's some that don't want to know, and they're just closed off. There's some who are curious, but they want to know so that they could refer to somebody else, so they're open, but they don't want to do it themselves because they're busy. And then there's another group of providers that are very curious and would love to help their patients, but need more building blocks, right? So part A is the reason I have been teaching this is my 30th year. I started teaching, longer ago than that, but if we just go with physicians, 30 years, 1994. The reason I've done it so long is, as I learned things, what I realized slowly over time was, I would get a lot of questions, et cetera. And I would think, everybody else, in your own mind, you think, everyone else has probably learned this already too. And what I realized is, not everybody has, right? So initially I spent a lot of time, doing teaching and stuff, but not, it wasn't meant to sort of, last a long time or whatever. And then I realized, I'm answering this one question twice a week. What if I wrote the answer out, right? Or what if I recorded a little webinar about how to do that? And then, as websites became available, and I paid a web designer, like stuff that you don't even have to do now, and coded all this stuff. And so I took all of my classes that you were talking about, like the board review classes, and I put them online, and then I made them free. So I was certainly not doing that for money at that point. And then I started to use that technology to put these answers in, et cetera. So part of what I spend my time on when I'm not with my patients is trying to make a living record of the things that I learned the hard way, and so others have access to it. So that's one way I try to deal with it, because I can't convince every other doctor or whatever, But I have also lived long enough and taught long enough that even in the more conservative allopathic side of the world, I've been teaching in settings where sometimes I was the first or second, non-hardcore allopathic doctor at that conference, which was really chillier in the early days. But I heard back from those doctors years later that, I almost walked out when you went up to speak, because I thought, what would this guy know? And then he says, I listened, and I realized, you actually had more science behind what you were talking about than most of the other speakers that day, so maybe you did know something. And then so that's greased the wheels a little bit, as far as trying to help other doctors. The other side of it is, there's a living record of information that I'm trying to keep adding, and it's pretty big now. The group in the middle that want to help their patients but just don't know kind of what direction should we go, what questions should we ask, whatever, or who would I refer to, is growing. There's a little more open-mindedness, et cetera. And the way in there that I've found is the more resources you have that you can point them to just to legitimize their thought, that their other colleagues might say, that's BS, or that doesn't work, or whatever. if there's a resource and they can look and say, yeah, that looks like what my patient needs, then they might actually be able to either help the patient or get them to somebody who can help them, right? So I had to realize I can't help each individual patient. There's just not enough, hours in the day ever. But if I can kind of systemically help, then that will help more people downstream. And I have colleagues I work with who are very much not even in the integrative space. They're just in the allopathic world as specialists, but they deal with things that only a minority of the allopathic world deal with, and they just get all the referrals for all that stuff. And as I talk to them, they now most of them don't have websites that way, but they will, publish guidelines and do things like that so that then their colleagues, when they do get one of these patients, don't have to start from scratch. And we just did this with a patient that I'm working with on the East Coast. Their gastroenterologist is like, I'm as frustrated as you are. I want to help you. Can this other doctor, who this guy is on the West Coast, can they point me to something that would help? Because we were going to go do biopsies and all this stuff. And so there's another gastroenterologist who works in this sort of, minority area of medicine, and it has published different things. So I get a hold of them, and I said, I know you have this. What's the best resource for this other gastro, one of your fellow people? And they sent me the link, and they said, yep, that's why I published this. Looked it up. It was like, that's exactly what this patient needs, and, connected it up. And so I try to do that where I can. I try to develop relationships with other doctors as I go out and, work and speak and stuff, so that then, if one of my patients needs something, they can do that. But also, the more people you expose in that middle group where their minds are a bit open, they want to help their patients, they just don't know where to go for this information because they were never taught it in school. It was never taught in their residency. If you can get them over that hurdle, then they can take it and run with it. Yeah. I've sort of long-term thoughts, which may be fantastical, but about someday like building some sort of referral network that could be accessed by people.
I like
because I know doctors in other countries now, and but like you, I get contacted from all over the world at this point, and I don't always know somebody there, and so sometimes it's like, well, see if they will look at least these things. Start with just the base, and often that's not been looked at. Or have, if they're a gastro or they're this or that, have them read this summary. They'll know that's the language they speak, but they've never, heard of it this way. They can look at it, make sense. They'll go and do it. Not certainly a majority, but I've had, CCU and ICU directors occasionally do things because a patient had a real oddball thing going on, and a family member knew me or something, and I sent them the information, and about 1 out of 20 will, move forward with it, or maybe 1 out of 10. But that can happen, and same with other specialists and things like that. So, but it's really hard because I think, we do what we do to help people, and you would really like to help everybody. It's just mathematically impossible to answer everybody's questions and help everybody. So I've sort of used the advent of, better electronic means to keep track of stuff in the last 15 years to try and build resources that, even if I disappear tomorrow, there's more than any one person could ever, probably get through on one of my websites.
I love it. No, I love your website. I watched it grow all the years. It is huge.
It is pretty big.
So this has been awesome. my first interview with someone, and it was 2 episodes long, and I have a lot more questions, but we'll go with just a 2-part for now. There's more you and I could talk about. I know, and we already have ideas. We'll get back to this together, and I appreciate it. I know I'm catching you right now before you're about to start at one of your conferences. If you're a care provider and you're interested, I'll let you bring up what's this. This is on neurodivergence. This is the one you're doing now, but just an idea of what Paul does at his conferences. Just brief. Then do you mind me?
Yeah.
Do you mind me plugging your work a little bit? I always don't know. I don't want to be all.
Yeah. No, that's cool. So we do 2 live conferences a year, and they're all in this sort of world of, specialty areas of medicine, but sort of taken to the next level. So it's called Advanced Applications in Medical Practice. This one coming up in a couple days is about neurodiversity, but we rotate topics. The one we have every other year is an oncology one, but we do a lot of things in the endocrine and neurospace and GI and mast cell, all the things that are just a little bit maybe more complex for patients, because the goal there is, and we get all types of healthcare providers to these to
all
help
my docs.
people.
You just let you. I don't know if I've told you. All my docs love coming to your things.
Okay.
And I have to. They're this is yours is a favorite. Just so you know.
I appreciate that. So we try and take the group that are already in it and they want to level up. So that's what I do there. But AAMP, Advanced Applications in Medical Practice, twice a year live. It's AMA credit. And the website, consultdra.com, is all of my recorded, webinars. But there's a lot of, like, all the reviews I've written and all the free Q&As and everything else. There's more free stuff on there than any that costs any money. It's a huge website now.
It is. So and the free thing.
Yeah.
I never did this podcast with the idea that I'm going to sell you a product or I'm going to try and convince you to come into my office, because then I've said this is a calling. I believe practicing medicine is a calling. That doesn't mean you should do it for free. I know that, but the goal in this is to make someone well. And I feel fortunate to have you in my life, because that's one of the qualities you also have, is you're dedicated to the wellness of the person in front of you more than you are to anything else. And it's such I'm very thankful for that. You've been a tremendous friend and a tremendous influence in a positive way in my life. Your comments, your shares, more than anything, let me say this. Your comments mean everything to us, and we read them. And for these 2 episodes, I'm going to drag him into the conversation as much as I can. So if you have questions regarding the material today, hit it in the comments, on YouTube or on Instagram, wherever you're seeing it, send us a comment, send us a question. This material matters to us. We're not just doing this. We're doing this for no other reason other than to be helpful. And so if something didn't make sense, if you want to understand it better, that's what we're here for. So your comments mean a lot. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you at the next episode.